It was a chilly evening when we decided to head out. My wife, Sophie, and I had been talking about getting away from the noise of the city for a while. Something simple, a weekend camping trip to clear our heads. Just us, the woods, and the peace of nature. I think we both needed it, really. Life had been hectic, and the idea of spending a couple of days away from work, our phones, and everything else felt like the perfect escape. We drove to a small national park just outside of Ashland, Oregon, about 2 hours from where we lived. The plan was to hike to a secluded spot we'd found on a map and set up camp by a quiet, small lake. We were both in our early 30s, relatively fit, and the thought of a short trek didn't intimidate us. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing weekend. As we made our way down the dusty trail, the trees were dense, their limbs heavy with the weight of fall. The air had that crisp, earthy smell. You know, the one where you can practically taste the pine. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long, slender shadows on the ground. I could feel the temperature dropping. We reached the spot just as the last bit of sunlight faded, our small campfire casting light onto the ground. We pitched the tent, a lightweight two-person that we'd bought for these kinds of trips. I made a fire while Sophie worked on dinner, the smell of garlic and vegetables hanging in the air. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. It was one of those comfortable silences you get with someone who knows you well. That night, we lay on our backs inside the tent, staring through the mesh at the stars above. It was quiet, too quiet almost, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise in the dark. The crackle of the fire outside, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant hoot of an owl, nothing alarming. But there was something strange about the way it felt, like the world was holding its breath. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The fire had died down, leaving only embers. The air was freezing. Sophie was still asleep beside me, her breath coming out in little clouds. But something was off. The stillness outside had changed. It wasn't the calm, natural quiet anymore. Felt wrong, like something was out there, just waiting. I wasn't sure what made me get out of the tent. Maybe it was the unsettling silence. Maybe it was just that gnawing feeling that had started creeping into my chest. Either way, I grabbed the flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent. Outside, the night was darker than I remembered. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the trees in an almost impenetrable blackness. The fire pit, now just a few smoldering coals, cast weak, flickering light. It didn't take long before I felt the cold seep into my bones. I stood there for a minute, listening, but all I could hear was the rustling of the wind in the treetops. Then I saw it. In the far distance, just outside the reach of the firelight, there was a figure standing between the trees. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But then it moved, slowly, purposefully. It was a man, tall, hunched slightly, wearing dark clothing. It was hard to tell much else. He was standing too far away, just beyond the reach of the light. But something about him felt off. I could sense it in my gut. He wasn't just some hiker or camper who had wandered too far off the trail. This wasn't a normal person. There was no sound as he moved, no footsteps on the dry ground, just that unnatural stillness. I stepped back into the tent, careful not to wake Sophie. I grabbed the small knife I kept in my pack and held it tightly in my hand. My heart was pounding in my chest now, my breath coming faster as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. There was no reason for someone to be out here at this hour, especially in the middle of nowhere like this. I looked back out the tent flap. The figure was still there, watching, not moving. I'm not sure how long I stood there, staring at him, but eventually, he turned and disappeared back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as he'd appeared. The feeling of unease didn't go away, though. It only grew stronger. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign of movement. Was he really gone? Or was he just waiting for the right moment to approach? Sophie stirred beside me. Her eyes blinked open, and she looked at me, confused but groggy. "What is it?" she whispered. "I think I saw someone," I said, my voice low. I didn't want to scare her, but the worry was all over my face. She sat up, looking out the flap of the tent, but I didn't want her to go outside. "Stay here. I'll check." I slipped out of the tent again, the knife still in my hand. My breath was shallow, my steps cautious as I moved slowly toward the campfire. There was no sign of the man, no movement in the trees. Everything seemed normal again, almost too normal. I stood by the fire for a few minutes, trying to calm my racing mind. What had I seen? And why did it feel like it was watching us? The thought that we weren't alone here in the woods was overwhelming, but I had to keep it together. We were just two people in the middle of nowhere. No reason to panic, right? Eventually, I decided to head back into the tent, but before I could make it, I heard something. A twig snapping. Just one. Like someone was stepping over it carefully. The sound was too close. Way too close. I looked around, but the figure was gone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the trees behind us. A shadow drifting like smoke in the darkness. My heart rate spiked again, but I didn't have time to think. Something told me it was now or never. I ran back to the tent, zippered it shut, and whispered to Sophie, "We need to leave. Now." She was startled but didn't argue. We packed up quickly, moving with a speed I didn't know we were capable of in the dark. We didn't waste time. I just needed to get us out of there. I couldn't explain why, but the urgency of it gnawed at me. As we hurried down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. But the trees were still, the night still. We were completely alone. Took us hours to find our way back to the car. By the time we were safely driving home, the sun was already rising. Looking back, I don't know what it was that made me feel so uneasy. Maybe it was the way he moved, like he wasn't fully human. Or maybe it was the way he just stood there, waiting. Whatever it was, I've never gone camping again. The woods are vast, and in those quiet, isolated spaces, you can never be sure what's watching you from the shadows. I remember the trip like it was yesterday. It was late September, just before the cold really settled in. The air was crisp, the leaves had started turning, and the smell of damp earth clung to everything. It was the perfect time for a solo camping trip, or at least that's what I thought. I had driven a couple of hours out to a national forest that wasn't too popular. One of those places that only locals really knew about. The kind where the trails weren't marked too well and the campsites weren't official. That was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, peace, and a break from the constant hum of life back in town. I parked my truck off a dirt road that cut through the woods and hiked in about 5 miles, just deep enough that I wouldn't have to worry about running into anyone. I found a small clearing near a stream, far enough from the water to stay dry but close enough for convenience. It was a beautiful spot. The trees formed a natural wall around me, and the ground was soft with a thick bed of fallen leaves. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got to work making a small fire. By the time the sun started setting, I was settled in. I had a simple meal, stretched out near the fire, and listened to the sounds of the woods. The occasional crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as the darkness fully took over and the fire was the only real light source, I started to feel off. I've camped alone plenty of times, and I know the difference between normal forest sounds and something else. This was something else. First, it was just a feeling, that strange, almost primal sense that someone or something was watching you. I brushed it off. Being alone in the dark can do that to a person, and I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a footstep, not a twig snapping randomly in the woods, not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. A footstep, slow, deliberate, too heavy to be anything but a person. I sat up, every muscle in my body going stiff. My fire had burned down to embers, casting only a dim glow around the clearing. I couldn't see past the tree line. I listened. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a deer stepping through the leaves. I told myself that, forced myself to relax, and eventually, I crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily, though. Every noise, every gust of wind through the trees had me on edge. And then, sometime deep in the night, I woke up to something much worse. A sound just outside my tent. A quiet, deliberate shuffling. Something or someone was right outside. I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard I swore it would give me away. The fabric of the tent was thin, and I knew that if I made a sound, whatever was out there would hear me. Then slowly the sound moved, around my tent, circling. I reached for the knife I always kept nearby when I camped. My fingers curled around the handle, but I didn't move. I just listened. The steps stopped. The silence was worse. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed, maybe hours. And then finally I heard it. Faint but there. A single step. Then another. Moving away. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light filtered through the trees, I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started hiking back toward my truck. I didn't care that I'd only planned to stay another night. I wasn't staying out there any longer. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every sound put me on edge. Every shift in the trees made my heart race. Then, about a mile from my truck, I found something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A footprint. A human footprint. Barefoot. Right there in the middle of the trail. And it wasn't mine. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just moved. I walked as fast as I could without running, without looking back. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and as I pulled back onto the dirt road, I glanced into my rearview mirror. Nothing, just the trees. But I knew something or someone had been out there with me, and they had been watching. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. Just me, the open woods, a tent, and a couple of nights under the stars. I had always been the type who preferred solitude when camping. No crowded campgrounds, no noisy groups, just nature and me. I chose a spot deep in the forests of British Columbia. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I had found a couple of years back while hiking. It was far enough from any trail that I never saw another person when I camped there, and the land sloped down to a small river, which made for a great water source. The surrounding trees were thick, mostly firs and pines, their canopies dense enough to make it feel like dusk even in the middle of the day. I had camped there a few times before and never had any problems. No bears, no unexpected visitors, just silence and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I arrived early in the afternoon, parked my truck about a mile away from the site, and hiked in with my gear. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the ground was soft under my boots. The rain from a few days ago had left a few muddy patches, but overall, the ground was firm. I had checked the weather beforehand, no rain expected, just cool autumn temperatures. I set up my tent near the base of a large tree, facing the river, then gathered wood for a fire. By the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, I had everything ready. The fire crackled softly as I sat beside it, eating my dinner, a simple meal of canned beans and jerky. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, an occasional owl hooting in the distance, the gentle rush of the river. It was perfect. That first night was uneventful. I fell asleep warm in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind push through the trees. When I woke up in the morning, everything was as it should be. No disturbances, no signs of animals near my tent. I took my time making breakfast, drinking coffee from a tin mug as I watched the sun climb higher. I spent most of the day exploring the area. I hiked along the river for a few miles, followed game trails through the trees, and even found a small clearing I had never seen before. It was a beautiful day, cool but not cold, the sun occasionally breaking through the canopy. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something strange. As I made my way back toward camp, I had the uneasy feeling that something was off. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I was just too deep in my own head. But then I saw it. There were footprints in the mud near my camp. They weren't mine. I froze, staring at them. They were fresh, probably within the last few hours, and they led from the tree line toward my tent. My first thought was that maybe another hiker had stumbled across my site, but the location was too remote for that to be likely. I followed the tracks carefully. They circled my tent once, then led toward the fire pit. Whoever had been there had stood near my fire, then walked a few feet toward the river before disappearing into the woods. I looked around, my heart pounding. The forest was silent, too silent. That was what set me on edge the most. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone watching me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to be chased out by something that might have been nothing. Maybe it had been a hunter passing through. Maybe someone had just been curious about my campsite. There was no real reason to assume anything worse than that. I kept my knife on me as I went about my evening routine. I built up the fire, cooked my food, and tried to act normal, even though every fiber of my being told me something wasn't right. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made me jolt awake. The wind shifting the trees sounded like footsteps. The distant snap of a branch sent my heart racing. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard something, a noise that didn't belong. It was faint at first, a soft shuffling, like something moving through the undergrowth. Then it grew closer, a deliberate sound. I lay completely still, barely breathing. My knife was in my hand, my fingers tight around the handle. The sound stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, not an animal, person. I stayed motionless, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, just as slowly as it had come, it faded away, footsteps retreating into the woods. I waited until the first light of dawn before unzipping my tent. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was still eerily silent. I checked the ground. There were more footprints. This time, they led right up to my tent. Someone had been standing there, just inches away from me as I slept, watching. That was enough. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. The entire time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. The hike back to my truck felt longer than it should have. The trees pressed in on me, and every little sound made my pulse spike. But I didn't see anyone. When I reached my truck, I locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A figure, standing there watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just drove. I never went back to that spot again. The rain had been coming down in steady sheets for hours, drumming against the canopy of trees above me. The campsite, deep in the woods of eastern Oregon, felt more isolated with every passing minute. I'd been looking forward to the quiet escape for weeks. Just me, my dog, and the forest. But as the storm worsened, the place started to feel less like a peaceful retreat and more like something I had stumbled into by mistake. I set up my tent as the first thunder rumbled across the sky, knowing the worst of the storm was still coming. I'd camped here before, but something about this night felt off. Maybe it was the sudden intensity of the rain or the way the air seemed to have thickened, making it hard to breathe. The ground had soaked through quickly, turning everything into a muddy mess. Even with the tarp beneath the tent, I could feel the cold dampness creeping in through the floor. The wind picked up, sending a shiver down my spine as it whistled through the branches above. My dog, Buddy, a golden retriever, was already in the tent with me, lying on his side. He wasn't usually one to be affected by weather, but even he seemed uneasy tonight. He kept shifting around, occasionally whining softly. I opened the small camping stove I had brought, lighting it with a match to prepare some dinner. The warm glow from the flame flickered against the walls of the tent, casting long shadows on the fabric. I'd hoped for a quiet night to reflect, but the rain and the wind had other plans. The sound of the storm combined with the occasional crack of thunder rattling through the trees had made it hard to focus. By the time I finished eating, the night had settled into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the soft pattering of raindrops. My phone had no signal, not that I expected it to. The area was remote, a place where people went to disconnect. But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't an immediate threat, just a growing sense of unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. Buddy got up suddenly, ears perked, his head tilting toward the door of the tent. He didn't bark, but his body was rigid, alert. I tried to calm him down, but something in the way he was acting made the hairs on my neck stand up. I stood, unzipped the flap of the tent, and peeked out into the blackness. The rain slanted sideways, and the wind howled through the trees, but there was nothing out there, just the wet, dark wilderness stretching endlessly into the night. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, though. I felt it deep in my chest. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. There were no other campers this far into the woods, I told myself. No one would be out here in weather like this, and if anyone was, they'd be crazy to get this close to my campsite. I zipped up the tent again and sat down, trying to ignore the feeling of paranoia creeping over me. Buddy finally settled down, lying back on the ground, though his eyes still flicked toward the entrance. I leaned back, letting out a deep breath. The rain had slowed a bit, and I decided to try and get some sleep. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to Buddy growling softly. The sound was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then he did it again, more insistently this time. His body was tensed, hackles raised, and his growl grew louder. I sat up, listening. It was quiet, too quiet.
No rain.
No wind, just the faint sound of Buddy's growls. I looked out the small window of the tent, but all I could see was darkness. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, the type of feeling that made me question everything I had ever learned about being alone in the woods. I grabbed the flashlight from the corner of the tent and clicked it on, scanning the area outside. But nothing was there, just the windswept trees and the wet, muddy ground. Then I heard it, a rustling sound from somewhere in the trees behind me. It was faint but distinct, like someone or something moving through the brush. My breath caught in my throat. I listened harder. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was out there, moving quietly, trying not to be heard. My heart began to race. I flicked the flashlight off, listening carefully. The rustling stopped. For a moment, All I could hear was the thudding of my own pulse. I waited, trying to steady my breath, but the noise had stopped. Was it an animal, or had I imagined it? Maybe it was just the wind, playing tricks on my mind. Buddy's growl turned into a low, rumbling bark, and he jumped up, his eyes locked on the entrance of the tent. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight again, shining it out the door of the tent, and froze. There, just at the edge of the light's reach, stood a figure. A man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could make out the shape of his body. Tall, broad, dressed in dark clothing, maybe a raincoat. He was soaking wet, but he didn't seem to mind the rain. His eyes reflected the light from the flashlight, and I could feel the weight of his gaze through the thin fabric of the tent. I don't know how long we stood like that, me, frozen in place, Buddy barking furiously, and the man just watching. I should have done something, but the sight of him in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, had paralyzed me. I wanted to call out, to yell at him, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but where? I was trapped in the middle of nowhere, and my only weapon was the fear clawing at my throat. The man took a step forward, and that's when I snapped into action. I grabbed the knife from my bag, clutching it tightly in my hands. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Was he here to hurt me? Was he lost? I didn't know, but I couldn't sit here and wait to find out. Buddy was frantic now, pulling at the leash I had tied him to inside the tent. I took a deep breath and, before I could second-guess myself, unzipped the tent flap and bolted outside. The rain hit me like a wall, soaking me instantly. My flashlight barely cut through the downpour, but I kept it trained on the man. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, his eyes reflecting the light like some kind of animal. I raised the knife, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "What do you want?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. The seconds dragged on, stretching into eternity. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quietly as he had come. I stood there for a long moment, the storm swirling around me, unsure of what had just happened. My breath came in sharp gasps, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I don't know what the man wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay in that tent tonight. I packed up as quickly as I could, tossing my gear haphazardly into my backpack. Buddy, who had calmed down somewhat, whined, but I didn't have time to explain. I couldn't stay here anymore. There was something wrong with this place, something I couldn't shake. I decided to hike out to get as far away from the campsite as I could. I didn't know where I was going or if I was even heading in the right direction. The storm had worsened again, the rain so thick it felt like the forest itself was closing in around me. But I didn't care. I had to get out. As I stumbled through the mud, I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there, just the woods. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was still watching me from the shadows. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally reached the edge of the woods and the road that led back to the main highway. I could hear the distant hum of cars and the sounds of civilization. It was enough to break the spell the forest had cast on me. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I couldn't help but look back into the dark woods. Whatever had happened tonight, I didn't want to think about it anymore. When I finally made it back to my car and started the engine, I didn't look back. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, somewhere watching. And maybe, just maybe, I had made a mistake by leaving him behind. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, a long stretch of highway that cut through empty fields and distant tree lines. It had been a long day behind the wheel, the kind of drive where the road in front of you seems endless, and every town you pass is smaller than the last. The gas stations were getting farther apart, the radio stations weaker, until all I could hear was static. My phone had lost service hours ago, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. I had left early that morning, heading west for a job that started in a few days. I didn't have a strict timeline, just an old truck loaded with camping gear, a cooler full of food, and a plan to stop somewhere quiet for the night. I had been keeping an eye out for a place to pull over, maybe a rest stop or a clearing off the road, but I hadn't seen much, just miles and miles of empty land, stretching out under a darkening sky. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, turning everything deep orange. The air had that heavy stillness that comes just before nightfall. I knew I needed to stop soon. I was getting tired, and driving drowsy in the middle of nowhere wasn't a risk I was willing to take. Then I spotted it, a dirt pull-off on the right side of the road, leading to a small patch of trees. It wasn't much, but it was something. I slowed down, flicked on my turn signal out of habit, though there was no one around to see it, and pulled onto the rough dirt. My tires crunched over gravel and dried grass as I rolled to a stop. It wasn't an official campground, just a little clearing hidden from the road by a thin line of trees. But it was flat, secluded, and quiet. That was all I needed. I shut off the engine and climbed out, stretching my legs. The silence out here was different from the kind you get in a city or even in a small town. There were no distant hums of traffic, no voices, no music. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional chirp of insects. I grabbed my tent from the back of the truck and set it up quickly. I had done this 100 times before, and my hands worked through the motions without much thought. Once the tent was up, I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and set my flashlight nearby. Dinner was simple, just a sandwich and a bottle of water from the cooler. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, eating in the fading light, watching as the sky turned from orange to deep blue. The temperature was dropping, and I could see my breath in the air. That's when I noticed it. Something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a prickling at the back of my neck, a slight unease settling in my stomach. I scanned the tree line, my eyes moving over the dark shapes of the branches. Nothing looked out of place. No movement, no sounds beyond the usual rustling of leaves. But the feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. Being out here alone with no other cars, no cell service. It was enough to put anyone on edge. I finished eating, packed away my food, and climbed into my tent. I zipped the door shut, clicked off my flashlight, and lay back, listening to the quiet. It took me a while to fall asleep. That uneasy feeling lingered, making my thoughts race. But eventually, exhaustion won. My breathing slowed, my body relaxed, and I drifted off. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was the kind of wake up that doesn't feel natural, like something had pulled me from sleep. My eyes snapped open, my heart already pounding. I held my breath, listening. First, I heard nothing, just the wind, the occasional creak of branches. But then crunch, a sound just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, footsteps. My blood ran cold. I stayed completely still, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound came again, closer this time. Something moving just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers wrapping around the handle, but I didn't turn it on. If there was someone or something out there, I didn't want to give away my position. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I strained my ears, trying to hear past the hammering of my own heartbeat. Then, from outside, just inches from where I lay, I heard breathing. Slow, heavy, not an animal, person. I gripped the flashlight tighter, every instinct screaming at me to do something, to move, to run, but I stayed frozen. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away, crunch, crunch, fading into the distance. I didn't move. I waited, my body rigid, until the sounds disappeared completely. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, when I was sure I was alone, I reached for the zipper of my tent, moving as quietly as I could. I unzipped it just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. My truck sat where I had left it, the trees standing still in the cold night air. But something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. My stomach twisted as I crawled out of the tent, keeping low, my flashlight still off. I moved toward the truck, every step slow and careful. When I reached it, I peered inside. Nothing looked disturbed. The keys were still in my bag, untouched. The glove compartment was closed. The seats were empty, but then I saw them. Footprints, in the dirt, leading from my tent to the truck, then off into the trees. I stood there, heart hammering, staring at the tracks. Whoever had been here had left, but they had been close, watching, maybe trying to get inside my truck. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my sleeping bag, threw it into the truck bed, and ripped my tent down in record time. I didn't care how messy it was. I just needed to go. Within minutes, I was back in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the highway, tires spitting gravel. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a gas station near the next town. I pulled in under the bright lights, parked near the other cars, and finally let out the breath I had been holding. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Whoever had been out there, they hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't tried to hurt me, but they had been there, watching, and that was enough to make sure I never camped on the side of the road again. I never thought much about fear. It wasn't that I considered myself fearless, just that I hadn't come face to face with anything that truly unsettled me. Not in the way people talked about fear, the deep, gut-wrenching kind that makes your hands shake and your breath turn shallow. That changed one summer when I decided to go camping alone in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. I wasn't a survival expert, but I had been on enough trips to know the basics. I packed light but efficiently: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, extra batteries. I brought my old hunting rifle too, just in case. Not that I expected to use it, but it gave me peace of mind. There were bears in the area, and the thought of waking up to one sniffing around my tent didn't sit right with me. I picked a spot miles away from the nearest trail, deep enough in the forest that I wouldn't hear the occasional group of hikers passing through. That was the point, to get away from everything. I worked in construction, long days in the heat, dealing with people I didn't particularly like. The solitude was supposed to be a break from all that. I hiked in around noon, following an old game trail that I had found on a map weeks before. The forest was thick, the trees towering above like sentinels watching over the land. Birds chirped, the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. It was peaceful. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small creek and set up camp. The place was perfect: flat ground, plenty of dry wood for a fire, and fresh water nearby. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and sat by the creek for a while, letting the cold water run over my hands. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. As night fell, I built a fire and cooked a small meal, just some canned beans and a bit of jerky. The flames crackled, and the heat felt good against the evening chill. I leaned back against a log, staring into the fire, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard something else. It wasn't an animal noise, at least not one I recognized. A crunch of leaves, a deliberate step. Too heavy for a deer. I sat up, listening. Silence. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced against the trees. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon or some other scavenger sniffing around. Still, I took my rifle from where it rested against the log and set it across my lap, just in case. The night stretched on. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. I stayed by the fire until it burned low, then crawled into my tent. I kept the rifle close, my hand resting on the stock as I drifted off. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something was outside my tent. I lay still, holding my breath. The sound was faint, a soft shuffle, like someone stepping carefully through the leaves. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I reached for my flashlight, slowly, trying not to make a sound. The noise outside stopped. I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as I flicked the light on, there was a loud, deliberate crunch. Footsteps, slow, measured. Someone was out there. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. I couldn't see anything beyond the thin fabric of the tent, but I knew I wasn't alone. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only faint orange light against the trees. Then came the breathing. It was close, just outside the tent. A deep, steady inhale, exhale. I gripped my rifle, my finger resting near the trigger. My mind raced through options. Could be some drunk hiker lost in the woods. Could be something worse. I had to act. With a deep breath, I unzipped the tent in one swift motion and swung my flashlight outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the trees silent. The only thing moving was the fire, glowing faintly in the night. I stepped out slowly, the rifle raised, sweeping the light over the trees. My stomach was tight, my pulse hammering in my throat. I listened, but the forest had gone still. Too still. The usual sounds, crickets, owls, the rustling wind were gone. I stood there for a long time, scanning the darkness. Then, convinced that whoever or whatever had been there was gone, I retreated back into the tent. Sleep didn't come easy after that. By morning, I was ready to leave. Something felt off. I packed up quickly, my eyes darting to the tree line every few minutes. The whole time, I had the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. Then I found the footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. The prints were deep, made by heavy boots. They led off into the woods but didn't come back. Someone had been here, watching me. I didn't stick around to find out who. I threw my pack over my shoulder and started moving fast, following the creek back the way I came. The whole time, I felt like something was behind me, just out of sight. I didn't stop. Hours later, I reached my truck, tossed my gear in the back, and drove until I was miles away from those woods. I don't camp alone anymore. I still don't know who was out there that night, or what they wanted, and I don't ever want to find out. I was deep in the mountains of Montana, far from any town, far from anyone who could hear me if I screamed. It was late September, and the air had that crisp bite that signaled the beginning of the cold season. The leaves were already turning, a sea of reds and oranges stretching out across the rolling hills. I had been planning this hunting trip for months. Just me, my rifle, and the vast wilderness. I had driven out early in the morning, my truck bouncing along an old logging road, barely visible under the thick layer of fallen leaves. I was looking for elk, but I wouldn't mind a good deer if the opportunity presented itself. After a couple of hours of driving, I pulled off to the side, grabbed my pack, and started hiking into the woods. I wanted to get as far away from the road as possible. I didn't want to hear engines, didn't want to see another human. Just silence, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional distant cry of some unseen animal. After about 5 miles of hiking, I found a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded on 3 sides by dense pines, with a gentle slope leading down to a narrow creek. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and ate a quick meal before heading out to scout the area. I moved slowly, stepping carefully to avoid breaking twigs underfoot. The last thing I wanted was to alert every animal in the area to my presence. I found fresh tracks near the creek elk moving through the area recently. I followed them for a bit, noting their direction. If I was lucky, I could set up near a good spot in the morning and wait for them to come through again. As the sun started to dip behind the mountains, I made my way back to camp. That first night was uneventful. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rattled the branches, an owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and every so often, I could hear the faint rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. It was peaceful. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I took my rifle, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started toward the area where I had seen the tracks. I moved slowly, carefully, stopping every so often to listen. The forest was still waking up, the sky just starting to turn pink with the first hints of daylight. Then I smelled it, something foul, something that didn't belong in the crisp morning air. It was like rotting meat, thick and heavy, making my stomach turn. I stopped, scanning the trees around me, looking for any sign of a carcass. I had seen dead animals before, but this was different. This smelled old, like something that had been sitting out in the sun for days. I pressed on, keeping my steps light, my rifle in my hands, ready. A few minutes later, I found it, a deer or what was left of one. Its ribs were stripped clean, the hide peeled back like someone had been butchering it. But it wasn't right. The cuts were jagged, uneven, like they had been made with something dull or even torn apart by hand. I crouched down, inspecting the carcass. There were no bullet holes, no arrows. Whatever had killed this thing hadn't been a hunter. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. Something had been here recently. I had been hunting long enough to know that predators don't just leave a kill like this. If a bear or a mountain lion had taken down this deer, it would have stayed close, guarding its meal. I scanned the trees, but nothing moved. The forest was silent, too silent. I moved away from the carcass, my rifle tight in my hands. I didn't run, but I walked faster than before, putting distance between me and whatever had done that. I made my way up a ridge, found a spot with a good vantage point, and settled in to wait. Hours passed. I watched, listened. Birds returned, chirping lazily from the branches above. A squirrel darted across a fallen log. The forest was coming back to life. Then I saw movement, a figure half hidden by the trees. At first, I thought it was another hunter, but something about it wasn't right. They were moving strangely, not in the slow, careful way a hunter would. Their steps were uneven, almost staggering. I raised my rifle slightly, not aiming, but ready. The figure stepped out from behind a tree, and my stomach turned to ice. It was a man, or at least it had been a man. His clothes were torn, hanging in shreds off his body. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were empty, just dark pits, staring right at me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he took a step toward me. Something in my gut told me to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. But I didn't move, couldn't. Then he smiled. It was slow, unnatural, like his face wasn't used to the motion. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. He took another step. I raised my rifle. He stopped, For a long moment, we just stared at each other. My finger hovered over the trigger, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't normal. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I sat there for a long time, heart racing, waiting to see if he would come back. He didn't. By the time the sun started to set, I made up my mind. I wasn't spending another night out there. I packed up my camp in record time, barely stopping to eat. As I hiked back toward my truck, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing in the trees, watching me. I never did. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back and climbed in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Then I drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, back where there were people, lights, noise, things that felt real. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back to those woods since.